Hey guys, tonight we're headed to a sleepy riverside village in southern Vietnam, a place where the days pass slowly and the air always carries the scent of warm earth and river mud. Picture narrow dirt paths winding between banana trees, tiny stilt houses with rusted tin roofs and old wooden boats bumping against the banks like they're whispering secrets to each other. Crickets chirp even in the daytime, and laundry flutters on bamboo poles like sleepy flags. You might not have experienced this before, but there's something about rural summers in the tropics. They move like thick honey, and everything feels just a little too quiet, like the world itself is napping. If you're cozy now, lights dimmed, maybe under a blanket or nestled against your pillow, perfect. This story is one of those memories that only grows clearer with time. It's about a raft, a cousin, and a river that didn't quite cooperate. And maybe about the strange little prize we found at the end of it all. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy little stories. It really helps the channel, and I love having you here. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. It was the summer I turned 11, and I remember it vividly, not because anything grand happened, but because absolutely nothing did. That was the problem. School was out, the monsoon season had passed, and the whole village seemed to settle into a humid daze. The grown-ups were busy with their own routines, tending the rice paddies, mending nets, gossiping under the banyan tree, and the kids were left to entertain themselves. We didn't have smartphones or tablets, obviously. What we did have were slingshots, half-deflated soccer balls, and an overgrown imagination. That was the summer everything smelled like river mud. Maybe it was because the river ran low and exposed more of its murky banks. Or maybe it was just because we were always near it, sitting on its edge, dangling our legs, watching dragonflies skim the surface. The Mekong wasn't majestic the way people might imagine. It wasn't blue or sparkly. It was wide, brown, and sluggish, moving like it was tired of going anywhere at all. But to my cousin Tom and me, it might as well have been the Amazon. Tom was 13, just 2 years older than me, but somehow it felt like 10. He was lean, always tanned, and had a permanent grin, like he knew something you didn't. He was also my best friend, despite being bossy and a little reckless. Whenever Tom had an idea, I followed. Not because I didn't have ideas of my own, but because his always sounded more exciting. This time, his idea was to build a raft and sail down the river, all the way down to, well, we hadn't figured that part out yet. "I'm serious," he said one afternoon, squatting next to the water, throwing pebbles into the shallows. "We could float to Can Tho, maybe even the ocean." I squinted at the water. "That's like hundreds of kilometers." He shrugged. "Not if we let the river do the work." It made perfect sense in a kid logic sort of way. We'd build a raft, launch it from the patch behind my grandma's house, and just go. We imagined waving to villagers, dodging crocodiles, sleeping under the stars while fish jumped around us. I even pictured discovering a new island. In reality, the river barely flowed more than a lazy crawl, and the only thing it carried fast was old leaves and mosquito larvae. Still, once the idea settled in, we couldn't shake it. The boredom of summer had met its match. That evening, we sat on upturned baskets behind the house making a list. I brought a half-burned school notebook. Tom brought the ambition. Between us, we had no tools, no money, and no adult supervision. First, he said, licking the end of a stick and drawing a wonky rectangle in the dirt. "We need wood." I nodded. "Where do we get wood?" "We'll use the door behind Grandma's shed." I blinked. "That's not a raft, that's a door." "Exactly, a flat door." It was hard to argue with that. We wrote down things like milk bottles for floating rope from the old fishing net, an umbrella for sun. At some point, fish sauce from Grandma's lunch spilled on the notebook, and the page curled up like it was trying to hide from the smell. Still, we had a blueprint. We called it the Mekong Explorer. That night I couldn't sleep. The air was thick and sticky and my mosquito net clung to my skin. But more than the heat, it was the anticipation. My mind ran wild with thoughts of adventure. What if we discovered a hidden cave? What if we met pirates? What if the raft actually worked? I imagined floating past familiar trees that became less and less familiar, our village shrinking into the distance. I imagined waving goodbye to boredom forever. It never occurred to me that the raft might not float at all. The next morning, Tim showed up at my house before the roosters had even cleared their throats. He had a dusty conical hat on backwards, a rusty wheelbarrow, and that same look in his eye, the one that meant we're doing this, and it's already too late to stop. "Grab your shoes," he whispered through the mosquito screen. I didn't ask questions. I just threw on a shirt, grabbed the notebook with the fish sauce stains, and tiptoed out the back before my grandma could wake up and assign us chores. The air was still cool and misty, the kind of morning that made everything feel possible. Our first mission was clear: we needed the foundation. That meant the old door behind Grandma's shed. It had been leaning there for as long as I could remember, warped slightly at one corner and covered in cobwebs. To us, it was a gift from fate, a flat, floatable piece of wood that no one would miss. Or so we thought. "Be quiet," Tom whispered, though the creaky hinges of the shed screamed like we were robbing a dragon. We dragged the door out, inch by inch, balancing it on top of the wheelbarrow. It overhung by nearly half its length, and it looked like we were carting a fallen bridge through the garden. We hid it behind a banana grove by the riverbank, then returned for supplies. That's where things got creative. In the notebook, we'd written down every material we thought might help the raft float. Plastic jugs, styrofoam slabs, fishing net pieces, 2 empty gasoline canisters we rinsed out until the river smelled like a mechanic's shop. The best find was an old stack of water bottles from a wedding party that had long since been abandoned to sun and dust. "More bottles, more float," Tim said, tying them under the door with bits of wire and fishing line. "This is basic engineering." At one point I suggested we call it engineering inspired by desperation, but he didn't laugh. He was too focused, tongue sticking out, wrapping another set of strings around the base. By mid-morning, we'd created what looked less like a raft and more like a floating junk pile with ambition. The bottles were uneven. The ropes were mismatched. The door creaked when you stepped on it. But in our eyes, it was perfect. We even added a flag, an old t-shirt we tied to a stick, scribbled with the words Mekong Explorer in blue marker. The ink bled halfway through, so from one side it looked like Me Exploder, which honestly wasn't far off. The problem came when we realized we'd forgotten to include any kind of steering system. "How do we turn?" I asked. Tim shrugged. "We don't. We let the river choose." That seemed both romantic and deeply flawed, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to be the one who doubted the dream. Lunch was fast, some cold rice and fried egg eaten on the steps, and we barely tasted it. Our minds were already back at the riverbank, where the raft waited beneath the banana leaves like a secret waiting to be told. That afternoon, we set about making our final touches. I borrowed an old plastic stool from my aunt's kitchen to use as a captain's seat. Tom added a bamboo pole for pushing off, though it was mostly for dramatic effect. When we weren't scavenging, we were drawing new blueprints in the dirt with sticks. We imagined compartments, maybe a tarp for rainy days, and a second level for sleeping quarters. We were planning a palace on water, completely ignoring the fact that we still hadn't tested the first float. By the time the sun began to slide behind the trees, casting a soft amber glow across the muddy river, our raft stood ready. If you squinted, it almost looked like something you could trust. We decided to delay the launch until the next morning, mostly because we were exhausted, but partly because Tom wanted to give it a sunrise departure. He claimed it was more epic that way. That night I couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't from excitement. It was something else, a quiet anxiety maybe. I couldn't stop wondering if the bottles would hold, if the knots would unravel, if we'd drift straight into a water buffalo. Still, as I lay in bed listening to the gentle lap of the river not far from my window, I reminded myself of something Tom said earlier. Every adventure starts with a dumb idea that somehow works. I wasn't sure if he meant that as encouragement or as a warning. By sunrise, the village was still yawning, half covered in mist. But Tom and I were already at the riverbank, crouched behind our raft like a pair of shipbuilders waiting for the tide. The air smelled like wet bamboo and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, someone was already frying something garlicky for breakfast, and I felt a rumble in my stomach, but adventure waits for no one's appetite. We did a final inspection, which basically meant pushing the bottles to see if they made a squeaky sound. They did, and tightening the knots with damp fingers. The whole thing groaned when we stepped on it, but it stayed afloat, gently bobbing, like it was trying to believe in itself. That was good enough for us. Still, one problem loomed large: adults. We hadn't told anyone what we were doing. Not our parents, not our uncles, not even Tom's older sister, who usually tattled on everything. We were certain if any grown-up found out, the raft would be dismantled before it touched the water. So we worked in silence and shadows, sneaking supplies like two secret agents on a mission-coded Operation Don't Sink. But we couldn't gather everything on our own. So we started making trades, quiet ones. Tom, being the more charismatic one, went around the village pretending to be interested in everyone's junk. He offered to carry water for our neighbor in exchange for a roll of duct tape. He gave up his favorite comic book just to get a handful of nails from the carpenter's shed. He even offered me up to help my aunt wash shrimp, which to this day remains the smelliest bribe I've ever participated in. In return, we got treasures, foam pads, a small cooking pot, a broken umbrella that we swore could double as a sail, and even a half-empty can of waterproof sealant that smelled like melted rubber and rotten eggs. That last one became our holy grail. We used it to coat the bottom edge of the door, convinced it would give the raft magical water-repelling powers. In reality, we just made it smell worse. The whole thing took about 3 days. 3 days of ducking between banana trees, dodging curious cousins, and stuffing things under shirts like nervous squirrels. One time, my grandma spotted us carrying a crate of empty bottles and raised an eyebrow. "You two better not be making something dangerous." "No, Grandma," we said in unison too quickly. She stared for a second, then went back to peeling papaya. We weren't just gathering supplies. We were also building the story we'd tell later, how we did it all ourselves, how we crafted an unsinkable vessel, how we didn't need any help, even though half the village unknowingly donated parts of it. In our minds, we were explorers preparing for the open sea. The fact that we didn't know how to swim well didn't seem relevant. There was one moment I remember clearly: late afternoon, the third day, right before the first launch attempt. We were sitting side by side on a fallen log, drinking warm tamarind juice and staring at the raft. It still looked ridiculous, lopsided, multicolored, patched together like a floating jigsaw puzzle. But we were proud. "You know," I said, "maybe we could make it all the way to the ocean?" Tom nodded. "If we do, we'll write a book, sell the movie rights. And if we don't," he grinned. We disappear mysteriously. The raft's found drifting empty. People tell stories for years. The sun was dipping low, painting the river orange, and for a brief second I believed him. I believed we could become legends. Then a frog jumped out from under the raft and startled us so badly we both spilled our drinks. That night, as we made final preparations, we packed a bag with 2 boiled sweet potatoes, some dried anchovies, a bottle of water, and a tiny flashlight that only worked if you smacked it first. Tom also insisted we bring his grandfather's compass, which didn't spin anymore, but still looked cool. At the last minute, we added my sister's tin whistle for emergencies. We said, though, the only emergency I could think of was a need to annoy someone loudly. By this point, the raft was starting to feel real. It had weight, purpose, and our fingerprints all over it. We even gave ourselves roles. I was the supply chief and navigator. Tom was captain and paddle master. We'd both read enough adventure books to know these things mattered. The plan was simple. Tomorrow morning, before anyone was awake, we'd shove off from the edge of the riverbank behind my house. From there, we'd follow the current, such as it was, and drift past the village through the reeds and onto whatever destiny awaited. We didn't have life jackets, we didn't have maps, we didn't have permission. But we had duct tape noodles and dreams. And at 11 and 13 years old sometimes, that's all you need. We launched at dawn just as the sun started peeking over the tops of the palm trees, casting streaks of pale gold across the river. Mist hovered low above the water, and everything was quiet except for the occasional splash of a fish and the distant creak of a neighbor's door. It was the perfect hour. The adults were still in their hammocks or bent over tiny clay stoves, too busy with breakfast to notice two boys sneaking off with a boat that barely qualified as one. We pushed the raft into the shallows, our feet sinking into the muddy bank. It was heavier than we remembered. The bottles groaned and shifted beneath the wooden door, and a few of the ropes made a whirring twang as they tightened under the weight. Tum gave me a look, the kind that said now or never. "Ready?" he whispered. "No," I whispered back. But I climbed aboard anyway. The raft wobbled, tilted left, and then miraculously steadied itself. The bottles held. The door stayed above water. I sat cross-legged on the plastic stool, our so-called captain's chair, holding the paddle, a single bamboo pole shaved at one end, with a knife that was far too dull. Tum jumped aboard like a pirate. The raft shifted, creaked again, and then we were floating. The Mekong carried us forward with a slow, sleepy push. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, but it was moving. We looked at each other, eyes wide with disbelief, and then burst into laughter. "We're actually doing it," I said. "We are legends," Tum declared, raising his paddle in victory like a general in an old war movie. We drifted past the edge of the banana grove, past the muddy slope where water buffalo sometimes bathed, and into the part of the river where the current picked up just a little. The air was thick with dragonflies and the smell of morning fires. Somewhere in the trees, a bird trilled a note so clear it felt like it was announcing our departure to the forest. For a moment, everything was perfect. And then the first bottle broke loose. It bobbed up beside the raft like a jellyfish escaping captivity. Then another one. A low gloop came from the back of the raft where the foam had started to sag. I scrambled to the edge, trying to hold it together with my hands like I was plugging a leaking dam with my fingers. "Tum," I yelled. He was already leaning over the side trying to grab a drifting bottle with the bamboo pole. "Don't worry," he said through gritted teeth. "We've got at least half of them still." Crack. That was the sound of the back panel, the chicken coop board we'd nailed on for extra support, splitting under pressure. Water rushed in through a newly opened seam, soaking the tarp where we'd kept our supplies. The boiled sweet potatoes floated briefly before one slipped off and disappeared beneath the surface, never to be seen again. "We're taking on water," I cried, as if we were aboard the Titanic. "Don't panic," Tum shouted, panicking. I grabbed the tin whistle and blew it. Why, I'm not sure. It didn't help. It just startled some ducks nearby. Within seconds, we were ankle deep in muddy water. The raft was sagging to the left, tilting like it had decided this voyage was no longer in its best interest. I tried to bail with the empty canteen, but it was hopeless. The raft wasn't sinking fast, but it was definitely sinking. And then came the final betrayal. The bamboo pole got stuck in the riverbed. Tum pulled, twisted, and yanked, but it refused to come loose. He let go in frustration, and it slowly tipped sideways and floated away like it had somewhere better to be. Abandoned ship, I asked weakly. Tum sighed. Abandoned ship. We jumped into the shallows, which only came up to our thighs, and dragged the raft toward the shore. It wasn't exactly dramatic. No swirling whirlpool, no tragic goodbyes. Just two soggy kids pulling a disintegrating dream out of the water while trying not to lose a shoe in the mud. We collapsed on the bank, panting, wet, and defeated. The raft, or what was left of it, lay beside us like a stranded whale with empty bottle barnacles. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then Tum chuckled. At least we floated. I rolled over and laughed too. Yeah, for 5 minutes. 6, he said. I was timing it. That afternoon, we hid the wreckage behind some tall grass and rinsed the mud off our legs in silence. A few curious frogs watched us like they were judging our engineering. We didn't speak of failure, not directly. Instead, we recounted how far we'd made it, how close it was to greatness, how no one else had even tried to build a raft from a door and bottles and foam. We'd dared the river, and while we hadn't conquered it, at least it hadn't conquered us either. Back home, we pretended we'd just been fishing. My grandma raised an eyebrow at our soaked shirts and sunburned faces, but said nothing. That night, I lay in bed with my limbs sore, and my pride a little bruised, but a smile still crept across my face. We had launched, we had floated, we had almost made it past the bend. And honestly, that was enough for now. We gave it a day. Just one day to lick our wounds, dry out the ruined raft pieces, and pretend we weren't completely embarrassed. By the next afternoon, we were back under the banana trees, crouched beside the wreckage with hands on our knees like two generals surveying a broken fortress. It wasn't the idea that failed, Tim said, pointing at the warped door with a stick. It was the materials. I nodded solemnly, though I wasn't sure what better materials we had access to. Still, the logic was sound. The door had warped, the foam had cracked, and the plastic bottles had been tied with the kind of knots you'd see on a toddler's shoelaces. If anything, we were victims of circumstance. So we started over. No blueprints this time, just instinct. Tum claimed this would be organic engineering. I wasn't sure what that meant, but it involved a lot more bamboo. We'd noticed the problem before the raft was too heavy, so this time we planned for lightness. We scavenged bamboo from a small grove near the footpath, slicing it into sections and dragging them down to the river one by one. Long, hollow, and surprisingly strong bamboo had always been used for building things in our village. If it could hold up bridges and fences, surely it could float two kids and a lunchbox. The next challenge was lashing the bamboo together. We didn't have rope, at least not anymore, since the first batch was still soaked in river slime. So we cut long strips of banana fiber and tied them in tight, overlapping knots. Tum had watched a fisherman do it once, and after a few tries, he figured out how to copy the binding method. To our surprise, it held. With each pull, the frame came together. It looked sleeker than the last one, lower to the water, longer, and not quite as noisy when stepped on. We decided to skip the captain's chair this time. Too fancy. Instead, we placed a folded straw mat across the top and anchored with old bricks and used strips of cloth to secure the deck. We even found a pair of deflated bicycle inner tubes in the back of the tool shed. After some wrestling with a pump that hissed more than it helped, we got just enough air into them to turn them into makeshift bumpers on each side. I feel good about this, I said, stepping back to admire our second attempt. Tum grinned. She's sleek, she's elegant, she's ready for war. We named this one Dragonfly 2, even though Dragonfly I had never existed. It just sounded cooler. This time we tested it properly. We pushed it out into the shallows with no one on board watching how it floated. It bobbed gently, stayed balanced, and didn't groan or tilt. We even threw a few rocks on it to simulate weight. Still steady. Let's ride it together, Tum said. I hesitated, then nodded. We waded out and climbed on slowly. The raft dipped slightly under our weight, but it held. No tilting, no cracks, no bottle jellyfish escaping. It wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy, but it floated like a dream. For a full 15 minutes, we drifted in slow circles not far from shore, kicking off the muddy bottom occasionally when we wanted to change direction. We didn't try to go far. We just enjoyed it. The world around us seemed slower from that low vantage point. The trees leaned in closer. The water felt calmer. We could see fish darting below little flashes of silver between the reeds. We could hear crickets even in the middle of the day. At one point, Tum sat back and folded his arms behind his head. We could live like this, you know. Out here? Sure, float down the river, eat bananas and grilled frogs. We don't even know how to grill frogs. He waved a hand. We'll learn. I smiled and leaned back too. The sun warmed my arms. The breeze rustled through the bamboo leaves overhead. And for the first time since the summer began, I didn't feel bored. Of course, it couldn't last forever. We were just starting to drift toward the deeper bend in the river when something splashed nearby. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp like a stone thrown into the water. I looked up, nothing there. Tum noticed too. He squinted toward the reeds, and then we saw it. A long, wriggling ripple just under the surface. Slender, sinuous, and unmistakably alive. Snake. I didn't even have time to scream. I just froze. Tum grabbed the paddle and started thrashing the water near the raft, trying to scare it off. The raft rocked wildly. I gripped the edge, heart-thudding stomach, flipping like we were already sinking. The snake surfaced for a second, just the head glistening in the sun, before disappearing again beneath the bamboo slats. We're going back, I shouted suddenly, forgetting how peaceful the world had just felt. Tum was already paddling like his life depended on it, which honestly it might have. We zigzagged back toward the bank, the raft bouncing and squeaking under our frantic movements. By the time we hit the mud, we didn't even tie the raft down. We leapt off, splashing into the shallows, hearts pounding, eyes darting behind us for any sign of scales or coils. No snake. Just the water calm again, as if it hadn't hosted the single most terrifying 5 seconds of our lives. We stood there dripping and panting, not saying anything for a full minute. Then Tum muttered, "Let's take a break." A long one, I agreed. We pulled Dragonfly 2 onto the bank and sat in silence, trying to pretend we weren't traumatized. I mean, we didn't even know what kind of snake it was. Could have been harmless. But when you're 11 and 13, every river snake might as well be a python. Still, for all the panic, part of me was proud. This time the raft had held. It had done its job. And even if we were never going to sail to the sea, we'd proven that we could build something that worked, more or less. We didn't touch the raft for 2 days. It sat there on the bank, half pulled onto the dry grass, looking like some strange animal that had wandered out of the river and fallen asleep. The mat was still damp. The inner tubes had lost a little air, but otherwise it looked fine, quiet, patient, as if it knew we'd come back eventually. And we did. Tom showed up just after breakfast on the 3rd day, holding 2 sugarcane popsicles and wearing that same crooked smile he always wore when he had an idea he knew I'd say yes to. "Let's try again," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Did you see the snake?" He waved a hand. "It's probably halfway to Cambodia by now." I gave it half a laugh, but part of me was already slipping into my sandals. This time we didn't bring supplies. No sweet potatoes, no flashlight, not even the whistle. It wasn't a journey. It was just one last float, something quiet and simple before summer disappeared behind school uniforms and chalkboards again. The river felt different that morning. Warmer maybe, slower. The sun wasn't as bright and the trees cast long shadows across the muddy banks. We launched Dragonfly 2 without fanfare. No yelling, no fake captain accents. Just 2 kids climbing aboard a handmade raft as silently as they'd built it. We drifted past the same bend as before, this time hugging the shoreline. No snakes, no drama, just bird song and the gentle swish of water licking at bamboo. I laid back on the mat, hands behind my head, and stared up at the sky. A thin wisp of cloud slid by like it was floating on its own secret current. You think the grown-ups ever did stuff like this? I asked. Tum squinted toward the horizon. Doubt it. Grown-ups don't float. They just sink slowly into bills and soup. That made me laugh, but it also made me wonder. I tried picturing my dad, maybe as a boy, sneaking away with some old planks to build a raft of his own. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, I was glad I hadn't waited to find out if it was allowed. The raft creaked and shifted as we turned slightly with the flow carried by the smallest whisper of current. We weren't going far, just a little ways past where we'd stopped before. We saw the village from a new angle, tiny rooftops poking through the trees, lines of laundry like flags of surrender. Someone walking slowly across the narrow bridge with a bucket in each hand. From here, everything looked so small, even our world. And then something bumped the bottom of the raft. We both froze. Tum sat up straight, bamboo paddle in hand, eyes scanning the surface. Fish, I whispered. He nodded, but he didn't sound convinced. We held our breath, waited, nothing. Then thump. Not hard, just a nudge. I leaned over the edge, heart ticking. There was something caught just under one of the bamboo slats. Not alive, not moving. It looked like a piece of cloth or maybe paper stuck to a bit of waterweed. Give me the pole, I said. Tum handed it over, and I gently prodded the edge of the thing. It wriggled loose, floated to the surface, and spun lazily in a half circle. It was a sandal, a single battered mud-soaked sandal. "You," I said, ready to push it away. But then something glinted inside it, barely visible. A tiny pale blue shape half buried in the heel. Tum leaned closer. Wait, is that a stone? I reached down, grabbed the sandal, trying not to think about what else had stepped in it, and pulled it up onto the raft. Nestled in the heel, wedged into the old rubber, like it had been pressed there over time, was a little marble. Cloudy blue with swirls of white and a single gold fleck in the center. It looked like a miniature planet. "No way," I whispered. Tum held it up to the sun and it shimmered. "Treasure," he said, completely serious. "It probably wasn't worth anything. It was probably just some kid's marble from years ago, lost during a swim or thrown from the bank on a dare. But to us, it was the most magical thing we'd found all summer." We sat in silence for a long while after that, just listening to the water and the wind and the gentle creak of the raft beneath us. I turned the marble in my fingers over and over, feeling the smooth glass, watching the gold fleck catch the light. "This is the kind of thing you only find if you build a raft," I said quietly. Tim nodded. "Or if you dig through old sandals, but your version's better." We laughed again, but it was softer this time, sleepier. The kind of laugh that only comes when you know a moment is ending. Eventually, we turned the raft around. We paddled slowly back toward the village, toward the banana trees and the muddy slope where this whole thing had started. We didn't talk much on the way back. There wasn't anything left to plan. No next version of the raft. No grander adventure. Just the sound of our paddles brushing through the water and the weight of the marble resting in my palm like a secret. When we pulled Dragonfly 2 onto the riverbank for the last time, there was no ceremony, no salute, no dramatic farewell. We simply dragged her halfway onto the grass, tied her loosely to a post with a leftover strip of banana fiber, and left her there to dry. She'd done her job. Twice, in fact. The sky was already tilting into afternoon, that sleepy golden hour when even the chickens seemed to take naps. We walked home slowly, barefoot, our sandals in hand, the sun warming our backs and drying the muddy splotches on our legs. My fingers still clutched the marble, though now it was tucked safely into the tiny inner pocket of my shorts, the one I never used for anything except things I didn't want to lose. We didn't say much. I think we were both too tired to talk and too full of that strange kind of contentment that only shows up after something small and beautiful ends. Not sad exactly, just settled. Back at my house, Grandma was hanging split banana chips on wire hooks, letting them dry in the afternoon sun. She glanced at us with her usual half-suspicious look. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Just floating," I said. She squinted at us, then at the river behind the trees, then at our muddy legs and sun-pink faces. That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. Tom plopped down on the front step, stretching his arms behind his head, like a man who just returned from sea. I joined him, sitting on the cooler tiles and letting the shade wrap around me. The cicadas were getting louder now, buzzing like 1,000 sleepy lawnmowers. "I think we're done," I said quietly. "With the raft, with the raft, with the river, with everything." Tom smiled but didn't open his eyes. "Yeah, until next summer." And that's how we left it. The next few days slipped by like soup, slow, warm, and without a lot of shape. I helped Grandma in the garden. Tom went to visit his uncle in the next village. We didn't talk much about the raft after that. Not because we'd forgotten it, but because we both knew that once a story has a good ending, it's best to let it rest. But something strange happened the day before school started again. I was helping Grandma sweep leaves from the back porch when I noticed something by the river. At first I thought it was just debris, a broken basket maybe. But when I looked closer, my heart sank. Dragonfly 2 was gone. The rope we'd tied her with still dangled from the post, the ends frayed and wet. There were no signs of dragging, no footprints, no snapped bamboo. Just a soft impression in the grass, and a few bottle caps left behind like breadcrumbs. I ran to the edge of the bank, scanning the water. Nothing. No raft drifting into the horizon. No sign of mischief. Just the same lazy brown current pretending it hadn't stolen our summer's masterpiece. Later that day, I found Tom and told him. He didn't seem upset, just tilted his head thoughtfully. "Maybe it floated away on its own," he said. I frowned. Bamboo doesn't untie itself. Maybe it got bored waiting. I laughed at that, but part of me wanted to believe it. That Dragonfly 2, loyal and patched together and slightly snake traumatized, had decided she'd had enough of sitting idle. That maybe the river had claimed her after all, giving her the ending she deserved. Not beached in the mud, but floating quietly past reed beds and fishing nets toward places we'd only imagined. That night I held the marble in my hand again, rolling it gently between my fingers under the blanket. It felt cooler than before, like it had absorbed something from the water. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, I tucked it back into the little pocket and turned off the light. I didn't dream of snakes that night, or sinking rafts, or falling into mud. I dreamed of floating, just drifting on a silent river, the air warm and full of dragonflies, the horizon wide open and waiting. The next time I saw Dragonfly 2, or at least what I think was Dragonfly 2, was nearly a month later. It was late in the rainy season. School had started up again, and my afternoons were filled with chalk dust, notebooks, and the sound of sandals squeaking down wet hallways. I hadn't thought much about the raft. Summer felt like a dream I'd barely remembered upon waking. But one Sunday morning I was riding with my father on his old motorbike, heading to the market in the neighboring village. We were passing a part of the river I rarely saw, deeper, wider, and lined with patches of water hyacinth that drifted like floating islands. And there it was, just a glimpse between trees. A tangle of bamboo plastic bottles and what looked suspiciously like an old straw mat, half submerged near the edge of a muddy inlet. It was broken in the middle. One of the bicycle tubes hung limply from the side, the rubber flapping in the breeze like a defeated flag. But something about it was unmistakable. "Wait," I blurted. My dad didn't stop. He just glanced at me in the mirror. "What?" I hesitated. "Nothing." I thought I saw something in the water. I didn't say it. I didn't explain. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to keep the moment for myself. Maybe I was afraid that if I named it, if I said, "That's our raft," it would become just junk again. Just trash in a river. Not what it had been to us. So I kept quiet. But that afternoon I told Tom, we were sitting behind the house eating dried jackfruit chips and flicking ants off the steps. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that hang like a promise. "I saw it," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded. "Still floating, kind of half sunk." He chewed a piece of jackfruit thoughtfully. Fitting. We didn't go after it, didn't try to retrieve it or repair it. We just let it go like kids who understand finally that some adventures aren't meant to last forever. The marble, though, I kept that. I made a tiny box for it out of matchsticks and glued a bit of red string around the edge like a treasure chest. I never showed it to anyone else, but I kept it on the highest shelf in my room right next to the window. It caught the light just right in the afternoons, that little fleck of gold glinting like a secret only the river and I shared. Over time, the story of Dragonfly 2 faded the way summer stories do. Tom and I grew older. New schools, new interests, different dreams. But every now and then, especially when the rain returned and the river swelled, I'd catch myself staring out past the banana trees, wondering how far our raft might have gone if we'd just held on a little longer. I imagine it sometimes, still drifting, still whole, carried slowly past villages and rice fields, bumping gently against the world, quiet and steady, the way only handmade things can be. I think about someone finding it, another pair of kids maybe, standing on the bank, pointing and shouting, imagining it was sent to them by the river itself. A gift, a mystery, a dare. And maybe they'd patch it up, name it something new, climb aboard with a bag of mangoes and a broken compass, and sail off just like we did. Maybe they'd even find something hidden in the bamboo, a marble tucked into a crack. Maybe they'd think it was a sign. I hope they do. Because for all the sinking and snakes and soggy snacks, that raft was more than a pile of bamboo and plastic. It was a ticket out of boredom, a badge of childhood, a lesson in building something that doesn't have to last forever to matter. And in the end, that summer was never really about reaching the ocean. It was about trying. So now, as you settle deeper into your blanket and let the weight of the day slip away, picture it just a slow-moving river, warm and quiet, curling like a ribbon through the countryside. The trees on either side leaning and casting shadows that dance on the water's surface. Somewhere down that river, a handmade raft drifts gently with the current. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't need to. It just floats, bamboo creaking softly, water lapping at the sides like a lullaby. Above it, dragonflies skim across the air, their wings catching the sunlight like bits of glass. There's no wind, only the whisper of tall grass along the banks. Somewhere nearby, a cicada sings a lazy song, as if even it is too relaxed to be in a rush. On that raft, you can imagine two kids lying side by side. One of them is holding a tiny marble, turning it slowly in his fingers, watching the way the gold inside catches the fading light. There are no plans, no destinations, just the comfort of the water beneath and the open sky above. And slowly, softly, the river carries them further away from noise, from time, from anything that asks for more than this moment. Let yourself drift there too. Let the water carry you just like that raft. No paddles, no maps, just the feeling of gentle movement, slow and safe. You're not going anywhere urgent now. You're simply floating. And as your breath deepens and your thoughts quiet down, remember, some of the best journeys are the ones that never needed to arrive. End of script. Sweet dreams.